You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. It was past midnight in June of 2020 in Sandusky, Ohio, and 25-year-old Lauren Wells lay in her bed wide awake. She had to be up early for work and had been trying to fall asleep for hours, but all night long, the faint sound of music coming from her upstairs neighbors had made sleep impossible. The tune they kept playing was extremely irritating. Sometimes it was very generic sounding, like elevator music. Then it seemed to switch to some kind of strange experimental jazz. Lauren had just moved into her apartment and didn't want to cause any trouble with her new neighbors, but they clearly were not stopping anytime soon. So she finally climbed out of bed and grabbed her broom. She was just about to knock on the ceiling with her broom when the direction of the music suddenly changed. Now it sounded like it was coming from next door. Lauren shook her head in frustration. She didn't want to start a fight with the entire complex, so she climbed back into her bed and threw her pillow over her head. She could still hear the music, but eventually she drifted off to sleep. The next morning at 8 a.m., Lauren arrived at her job as a nursing home administrator. She had just been hired 2 months ago, and she was proud that she'd gotten this position at such a young age. Running the nursing home was Lauren's dream job. She loved interacting with the elderly residents and wanted to make a difference in their lives. So even though she was running on fumes at this point from a lack of sleep, Lauren pushed through the day, checking in on staff and residents, and running various meetings. Thankfully, it was a Friday, so Lauren had the weekend to look forward to. She and her friends were heading to one of the islands off of Lake Erie, which is one of the Great Lakes. Lauren hoped some time outdoors would help her regain some energy. And the weekend getaway was just what she needed. The sun was out, there was a gentle breeze over the lake, and the water was cool and refreshing. Lauren was excited to reconnect with her best friends, and on their first night out, they went out to dance and have some drinks. She forgot about work and her annoying neighbors and just enjoyed herself. But as the evening progressed, Lauren found herself using the bathroom more than usual, but she figured it was just because she was drinking. A little while later, when she was on the dance floor, she felt a sharp pain on her left side. The pain stayed with her the rest of the night. She thought it was menstrual cramps and did her best to ignore them. Nothing was going to stop her from having a fun weekend. And by the time she got home Sunday night, she was feeling better, just like she had hoped. But soon after Lauren stepped into her apartment, her good mood evaporated. Her neighbors were playing that annoying elevator music again. The faint melodies seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Lauren dropped her bags and shook her head. She wasn't going to let this upset her. It was late and she knew she needed to get some sleep. So she unpacked and got ready for bed. But just like before, it was impossible to relax with that music coming through the walls. She tossed and turned for hours until finally exhaustion overtook her. When Monday morning rolled around, Lauren was definitely not feeling well. She figured she was paying for her weekend of partying, so she tried to shake it off. She made herself a cup of coffee and got on the treadmill for her daily run. But she'd only been on the treadmill for a minute when once again she felt an intense pain in her left side and had to stop running. It almost felt like someone was punching her hard, but from the inside. This pain went far beyond menstrual cramps. She figured something else had to be going on. Lauren thought back to everything she did at Lake Erie. She wondered if she had pulled a muscle while she was out swimming. It didn't seem likely, but she couldn't think of anything else that would explain the pain. Lauren had no idea how she was going to get through the day, much less the week, but she didn't want to call in sick. She was still new to her job, and people were counting on her. So she slowly got dressed while wincing in pain and got ready for work. And as she did, she thought to herself, at least her neighbors weren't playing that god-awful music. Once Lauren arrived at work, she did her morning rounds and sat down at her desk to take care of some paperwork. But as hard as she tried, she just couldn't focus. There was something distracting her. It was that weird music she kept hearing in her apartment. It made no sense that the same music would be playing in the nursing home. Lauren looked around just to see if there were any speakers nearby, but there was none. She tried to ignore the disjointed melody, but it was impossible. It seemed like it was coming from everywhere. But then she realized something that made her heart start racing. If there really wasn't any music actually playing right now, that could only mean one thing. The music was only happening in her head. She wondered if she was going crazy, but before she jumped to any conclusions, Lauren thought of someone who might be able to help her. She had a friend who was an audiologist, which is a doctor that specializes in hearing. Lauren called her right away and explained what was going on. She described the strange, repetitive sound and said it was following her everywhere. Lauren's friend listened patiently, then told her that what she was describing sounded upsetting, but it actually wasn't uncommon. She promised that Lauren was not going crazy. She said that sometimes people can hear melodies in everyday noises, like busy traffic or the hum of air conditioners, and just like songs that get stuck in your head, these sounds can do the same thing. Since Lauren was clearly so tired, she was probably more susceptible to hearing these noises. Her friend was sure that once Lauren just got some quality sleep, this weird music she was hearing would go away. Lauren was relieved, but also frustrated. The music was actually the thing keeping her from sleeping in the first place. But she was glad to know that if she could just get some rest, maybe her life would go back to normal. As the week went by, Lauren did her best to stay relaxed, but the music in her head just would not stop, and it continued to make sleep nearly impossible. And so a few days after talking to her friend, Lauren again dragged herself to work, and as she headed down the hall toward her office, she noticed a new odd sensation. Her hands felt like they were covered in a thick layer of dirt, and they felt sticky too, almost as if a glue stick had melted in her palm. She kept scrubbing her hands with soap and hot water, but she couldn't get them to feel clean. Lauren was totally confused. She'd never felt anything like this before. And it wasn't long before that same sensation spread to her feet. Lauren felt like her socks were glued to her toes. At first, it was just a little bit irritating, but then it became totally unbearable. She started going barefoot at work, which helped a little bit. She realized it was weird, but she couldn't stand the thought of putting her shoes and socks back on. Lauren was afraid that there was a connection between her auditory hallucinations and now her hands and feet feeling dirty all the time. But she had no idea what that connection could be. Lauren's instinct was telling her to go see a doctor, but she imagined how ridiculous it would all sound. She hung on to what her friend, the audiologist, had told her about feeling better with some rest. And so Lauren convinced herself that this was the weekend she would finally get some sleep and all these problems would just finally go away. That Saturday night, more than 2 weeks after her strange symptoms had begun, Lauren climbed into bed exhausted. She tried to ignore the strange soundtrack playing in her head, her sticky hands and feet, and the dull pain still in her left side. She pulled the comforter up to her chin, and she tried to meditate, letting the sounds of birds outside her window lull her to sleep. But after a few minutes, Lauren's eyes flew open. She realized that the birds singing outside her window were seagulls. Seagulls live near water, and there was not an ocean or a lake anywhere near her. The seagulls got louder and louder, and finally sounded like they might just fly right into her room at any second. Lauren knew that no amount of rest was going to make them go away, because just like the music, these squawking seagulls were in her head. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to see a doctor. Almost 500 miles away in Easton, Pennsylvania, Lauren's father, Brad, was sound asleep at home when his phone rang. He saw Lauren's name on the caller ID and felt his stomach tighten. She wouldn't be calling so late if something wasn't wrong. After he answered the phone, Lauren told him what had been going on for the past couple of weeks. She had reached the point where she was so worried about her symptoms that she was heading to the emergency room to get checked out. Brad could hear the panic in her voice, and that made him scared. He was fully awake now, calculating how long it would take him to drive to Ohio. He jumped out of bed and reached for his clothes, telling Lauren he was on his way, but she told him he should stay home. She wanted to see what the doctor had to say before he made such a long trip. Brad reluctantly agreed to hold off, but he told Lauren to call as soon as she had any answers. 30 minutes after talking to her father, Lauren arrived at the emergency room. She took a breath and then described her symptoms to the admissions nurse, expecting to get some strange looks. But the nurse just nodded and took some notes. Then Lauren was sent back to see a doctor who performed an exam and drew her blood. Lauren waited anxiously as they processed her results. And after a little while, the doctor approached Lauren's hospital bed. She searched his face, looking for any sign of concern, but his expression seemed totally relaxed. He told Lauren that her tests were completely normal. He didn't think anything was really wrong with her. As he spoke, he flipped through her chart and asked about her work. She explained she'd recently moved and started a new job. The doctor nodded and said he understood, and he said, Lauren, you're probably just stressed. And then he prescribed her some anti-anxiety medication, and he gave her an order to see a psychiatrist. Lauren was frustrated with the doctor's diagnosis, but he seemed to be certain there wasn't anything else going on with her. So Lauren left the ER feeling somewhat unsettled, and on the way home, she called her father, Brad. Lauren could always rely on him to be supportive and honest with her. She told him how annoyed she was that all these doctors just assumed she was stressed because of her new job. But she was thriving there and loved the new challenge. It didn't make sense to put the blame solely on stress. Her dad said he totally understood her frustration, but the doctors knew what they were doing. He asked Lauren to at least start taking the anti-anxiety medication. With any luck, they'd let her get some sleep, and then at that point, with a clear head, she could reassess her situation. Lauren was not convinced, but she promised her dad that she would try. Later that week, Lauren drove to work as usual. She'd been taking her anxiety medication, but so far, it really wasn't helping. She still heard all the mysterious music playing everywhere she went, and so she really wasn't getting more than an hour or two of sleep at night. She gulped down some strong black coffee, but nothing could cut through her brain fog. She'd been a zombie at work all week, often losing track of what she was supposed to be doing. Lauren turned into the parking lot, pulled into her parking spot, and then got out of her car, and as she walked towards the building, she left the engine running and her keys in the ignition, and her laptop and purse were still on the passenger seat. Lauren entered the conference room in a daze. She felt like she was moving in slow motion, and she barely registered the team of nurses who were already there for the weekly staff meeting. Lauren sat down at the table and tried to read the agenda, but the words looked like a jumble of hieroglyphics. At some point, Lauren tried to say something, but nothing came out of her mouth. She looked at the faces of her colleagues, who were now staring at her in confusion, and suddenly, Lauren realized she had no idea how she had gotten there or what she was supposed to do. The nurses who were at the meeting with Lauren could tell something was wrong with her. They helped Lauren lie down on a nearby sofa and took her blood pressure, which was extremely high. She could hear another nurse calling 911. Lauren tried not to panic, but the fear was overwhelming. Then her mind went totally blank. By the time the ambulance arrived, Lauren was starting to come out of her trance-like state. The fog that had been clouding her mind had lifted, and she felt more clear-headed than she had in a long time. She insisted that she did not need to go to the hospital, but the staff wouldn't hear of it. And so, after some gentle coaxing, they convinced Lauren to get in the ambulance. The paramedics took Lauren to a local hospital where doctors ran a series of tests. As she waited for the results, she felt surprisingly calm. She was so relaxed that she began texting her friends to come hang out with her in the hospital. She said she was having a great time. Lauren's friends were taken aback by these text messages. They knew what she was going through, and this just didn't sound like her at all. A little while later, Lauren's father, Brad, was busy at work when his cell phone rang. He'd been on edge the whole week, worrying about his daughter. When he saw it wasn't her number, he felt relieved. But then he realized the person calling him had an area code from Sandusky, the town where Lauren lived. Brad's stomach tightened as he answered. It was one of Lauren's friends. She told Brad that Lauren was in the hospital and that she was not doing well. This time, Brad didn't hesitate. He raced home, threw some clothes in a suitcase, and sped off to make the 7-hour drive to Sandusky. Meanwhile, Lauren was waiting at the hospital for more test results. One of her close friends, who had come to the ER, was sitting next to her. When the doctor came back to Lauren, he gave her some good news. Her test results had all come back negative, just like before. They couldn't explain what had happened to her at work, but physically she was fine and she could be discharged. Lauren thanked him, then she turned to her friend and said that it must have been another false alarm. But Lauren could tell her friend still looked worried. And deep in her heart, Lauren knew she wasn't okay, no matter what these tests said. Her symptoms might have temporarily gone away, but they were going to return, and as she thought about that, she began to feel this terrible dread come over her. Lauren asked the doctor if there was any other alternative to being discharged. The doctor hesitated, and then he said yes, there was, but it was drastic. Seven hours later, Brad finally arrived at the hospital in Sandusky, and he raced to the admissions desk. Just moments earlier, his daughter had called him with the stunning news that she was admitting herself into the psychiatric ward of the hospital, and so Brad, all he wanted to do was just get to his daughter. Once he entered the patient area, Brad was greeted by a doctor and brought to Lauren's room, but he was only allowed to see her through a shatterproof glass window on her locked door, and what he saw shook him to the core. Lauren was writhing on the floor, screaming and begging to be let out. She was trying to tear off her shirt. Food was splattered on the walls, and an empty tray and plate were upside down on the floor. Brad was stunned. Lauren had called him just a couple of hours earlier and seemed fairly clear-headed, and so he didn't understand how her condition could have changed so drastically. The doctor explained that he was giving Lauren medicine to treat schizophrenia, which is a serious mental disorder that causes people to hallucinate and experience delusions. They'd already started on her medication, but it would need time to take effect. Brad shook his head in disbelief. There was no history of mental illness in their family, and Lauren had always been so happy and well-adjusted. The doctor could only shrug. Schizophrenia did have a tendency to run in families, but it also struck out of the blue, usually in young adults anytime between their late teens and early 20s, and Lauren was 25. The diagnosis was terrifying. Brad was desperate to do something to help, but all he could do was wait for Lauren's medication to kick in. It was early in the morning when Brad left the hospital after Lauren had finally calmed down. He checked into a nearby hotel and sank into an exhausted sleep, thinking about his daughter and praying that she would be back to her normal self by the time he woke up. After sleeping for a few hours, Brad returned to the hospital, and when he got there, the nurse gave him a rundown of Lauren's condition. She said Lauren had begged the staff to use their hospital phone, and then when they said yes, she had called friends and relatives repeatedly, forgetting she'd already spoken with them. She'd also become very aggressive with the hospital staff. Brad insisted on going into his daughter's room, so they unlocked her door and he walked in softly, not wanting to scare her. Lauren was sitting on a rumpled bed staring into the distance. Her hair was disheveled and there were dark circles under her eyes. He almost didn't even recognize her. Brad struggled to stay calm as he sat down next to Lauren. He tried to comfort her and asked her if she needed anything, but she didn't respond. The medications she was on didn't seem to be working, but the doctor said it could take a while to kick in. Without anything else to hold on to, Brad clung on to that hope. Over the next few days, Brad anxiously waited for Lauren to improve as doctors tried different combinations of medications. But on the fifth night after Lauren was admitted to the psych ward, things got even worse. Brad had gone back to his hotel, and in a routine that had become too familiar, a phone call startled him awake. It was someone from the hospital. Lauren had experienced a massive seizure and was being transferred to the ICU for further testing. Brad ran to his car, and by the time he arrived at the ICU, Lauren was heavily sedated. He flagged down a doctor in the hall and bombarded her with questions, but it was clear that the doctor was just as much in the dark as he was. All she knew was that Lauren was in critical condition and they were trying to figure out what was wrong. Afterward, in the waiting room, Brad called friends and family to update them. He tried to piece together everything that had happened to her in the last several weeks, hunting for any clues that might explain her illness. but all he had was a long list of strange symptoms and events. Brad didn't know what to do, but he was desperate for answers, and so he began mentally going through his list of friends who might have some perspective that could be useful right now about Lauren. And as he did this, one name came up that he and Lauren both had in common: Ken Zemanek. Ken was the father of twin girls who were Lauren's best friends from childhood, and he was also a psychiatrist. And so Brad hoped Ken could provide some perspective about Lauren's mental state. When he got Ken on the phone, Brad was afraid that Ken would tell him the same things as all the other doctors, that it was possible Lauren had schizophrenia, or that Brad just needed to be patient and wait for more test results. But once Brad finished going through Lauren's extensive list of strange symptoms, Ken didn't say a word. After a long pause, he said that the hallucinations and mood swings did point to a mental issue. But what troubled Ken was the seizure. Schizophrenia couldn't have caused that to happen. Ken paused again, and then told Brad he did have another thought, one that could potentially explain everything that had been happening to Lauren. He described it as a, quote, rare bird, or extremely rare condition. He suggested that Brad ask Lauren's doctors to test her for this rare condition. Brad listened intently. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. After Brad hung up with Ken, Brad Googled anything he could find about this rare disease Ken had mentioned. And the more he read about it, the more convinced he became that it was what was happening to Lauren. Brad headed straight to the nurse's station and asked to speak with one of Lauren's doctors right away. For the first time since Lauren's nightmare had started, he felt a real glimmer of hope. The on-duty doctor arrived, and Brad told him about his conversation with Ken Zemanek, but the doctor was hesitant to test for it right away. The condition Brad described was incredibly unusual, and they needed to test for more common conditions first. Brad immediately tried speaking with another one of Lauren's doctors to see if maybe they would test for it, but that doctor said the same thing. They were going to test for common things first, and this doctor would say that in their entire career, they had never seen a patient with something that rare before. And so a parade of specialists marched in and out of Lauren's room, but every test they ran was inconclusive. As the hours ticked by, Brad's frustration grew. The next morning, Brad arrived at the hospital and headed straight to the ICU. As he walked down the hallway leading to Lauren's room, he heard a commotion of voices and the sound of beeping monitors. He ran into his daughter's room and saw a team of doctors hovering over Lauren. She was lying motionless on the bed and her eyes were closed. Brad stood there in shocked silence until a doctor noticed him and rushed over. He told Brad that Lauren's vital signs were dropping and they were working to get her stabilized. And so Brad needed to leave and go to the waiting area until the situation was under control. But Brad was sick of waiting in a medical twilight zone. His daughter was on the verge of death and they still had no idea what was wrong with her. He demanded they run the tests that he had requested about this rare illness. The doctor hesitated, but then nodded. He finally admitted that they were hitting a total brick wall and were at an absolute loss. But they were at a small community hospital, and so their resources were very limited to both test and treat Lauren for this rare condition if she were to have it. And so if Brad wanted to get her the help she needed, they'd have to transfer her to the Cleveland clinic, which was over an hour away. However, getting there was a huge risk. Lauren was so weak she could die on the transit. Brad was facing the biggest decision of his life, but he didn't hesitate. A few minutes later, Lauren was loaded into the back of an ambulance, headed for the Cleveland clinic. Brad followed behind in his car, praying his daughter could hold on just a little longer. When the ambulance finally arrived at the clinic, a medical team was waiting. Brad quickly parked his car and joined them as the team grabbed the gurney that Lauren was on and rushed her towards the entrance. Brad tried to stay calm as he watched them wheel her to the neurological ICU. Lauren's heartbeat barely registered, and she was having trouble breathing on her own. The doctors told Brad that her brain had also begun to swell, and so they needed to put her into a medically induced coma to help bring the swelling down. Lauren was given a strong sedative through an IV drip to put her into a state of unconsciousness. She was then hooked up to a ventilator that went into her mouth and down her throat to keep her breathing, and a feeding tube was inserted inside her nose and down into her stomach. Brad tried not to show how scared he was, but he knew Lauren was hanging on by a thread. Brad spent the next several hours anxiously pacing in the lobby of the ICU while the heads of several departments at the Cleveland Clinic teamed up in an attempt to save Lauren's life. Finally, one of Lauren's doctors walked in with the results of Lauren's newest round of tests. The doctor was incredulous. Brad and his good friend, Ken Zemanek, had been right. Lauren was sick with something that was so unheard of, most doctors would never think to even test for it. She had a disease called anti-NMDAR encephalitis. Anti-NMDAR is extremely rare, affecting only 1 out of 1.5 million people per year. It had only been identified 13 years earlier in 2007. The disease causes severe inflammation of the brain, which then results in hallucinations and a total psychotic breakdown. This explained almost all of Lauren's symptoms, like hearing the strange music and the seagulls and the sticky feelings on her hands and feet. But it turned out that NMDAR by itself wasn't what caused Lauren to get so sick. The doctor explained that the disease usually signified a deeper, even rarer underlying condition, which would have caused Lauren's other symptoms, like the pain in her side and the frequent need to urinate. Those symptoms were caused by a tumor in her ovary called a teratoma. Teratomas usually strike young women. This kind of tumor is made up of tissue from other parts of the body, like hair, muscle, nerve, organ, or bone. Normally, when the immune system recognizes a tumor in the body, it creates antibodies to try and kill it off. However, the specific type of antibodies formed from a teratoma can end up targeting more than just the tumor. They can also attack the brain and cause anti-NMDAR. In trying to defend her body against this tumor, Lauren's brain had accidentally attacked itself. Brad nearly collapsed from relief. They had a clear-cut answer for what Lauren was up against. It meant they weren't working in the dark. Now they just needed to get the tumor out. A surgeon removed the teratoma the next morning. It was 13 centimeters long, so more than 5 inches long. And unfortunately, it was malignant, which meant Lauren needed chemotherapy in order to fully recover. For the next 2 weeks, Lauren stayed in a medically induced coma. Once she was finally awakened, she couldn't remember anything that had happened to her. She had to relearn how to walk and how to talk, but day by day, she got stronger and was finally well enough to go home. 6 months later, Lauren got the news they'd all been hoping for. She was now officially cancer-free. After a full recovery, she went on to graduate from school and earned an advanced degree. Then, in April of 2022, she took a new job as executive director of a senior living facility. She never heard phantom elevator music or seagulls again. Located in the far northwestern section of Canada is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It is a massive swath of land that virtually nobody lives inside of. To make that point crystal clear, consider the following. The country of Germany has a population of 83 million people, give or take. The Northwest Territories is 4 times as large as Germany, but only has a population of about 50,000 people. In addition to being this huge and mostly unoccupied space, the Northwest Territories are almost completely wild. Think dense forests, huge mountains, massive rivers and lakes, and lots of really big animals. Even for highly experienced outdoorsmen and women, the Northwest Territories can be a truly hazardous place. And within this truly hazardous place, there is one part that is the most hazardous, and it's right in the middle of the Northwest Territories. And it's this 11,000 square mile stretch of just pure wilderness that's called the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was made into a national park. But don't let that fool you. This is not some family park that anybody can go to. There are no tourist accommodations, so there's no hotels, there's really nothing inside of it. And there are no roads that lead into this park. The only way you can get inside this valley is by plane or by boat or by very stressful and difficult overland hike. But for those who are able and willing to make the effort to get inside of this valley, you have the opportunity opportunity to explore one of the most beautiful places on the planet, because this section of the world is almost completely untouched by man. It is really nature at its purest form. However, there's a catch. This valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley have all either suddenly disappeared without a trace, like the Naha tribe, that literally overnight just was gone, leaving behind their shelters, their food, their supplies, just gone. No one knows what happened to them. Or the tribes have abruptly fled, claiming they were being terrorized or stalked by creatures lurking in the forest, like these white demons and these large wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore, and it might very well be that that's all it is, folklore. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that were not folklore. These things happened, and they were horrifying. These were horrifying, real events. And they might, depending on your viewpoint, give credit to some of the theories that the native tribespeople have about this valley, which is there's something evil lurking out in this forest, but we just don't know what it is. In 1904, three brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who all lived in the Northwest Territories, decided they wanted to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. They figured because so few people had ever been inside of this valley, that if there was gold to be found, then certainly it had not been found yet. And so after a very long and arduous journey using sled dogs and trains and homemade boats, they finally slipped into the valley and found themselves on what's called the Flat River, which runs right through the center of the Nahanni Valley. Now, the Flat River is kind of ironically named because it's anything but flat. It's actually more like a rapid at certain points. But either way, the three brothers, they're on their boat, they're making their way up the Flat River, and at some point they pull off onto the riverbank and they set up camp. And then once their camp is set up, they go down to the river and they put their gold sluices in the water. A gold sluice is this long, skinny box that's usually made of wood, and it has a strainer on one side. And gold miners will put it in the water submerged, and they will kind of shovel the sediment on the bottom of the water into this little funnel, and the big stuff will get stopped by the strainer, and the dirt and the water will just kind of flow out the side. And so the idea is you can trap gold nuggets inside of this sluice. And so the three brothers, they get their sluices up and they start looking for gold, and right away they hit pay dirt. There is tons of gold in this river. And so all day, all night, they get all this gold. The next morning they do the same thing, and by the time all their containers are literally filled to the brim with gold, they decide, hey, let's go back and turn this in, get some money for it, and then come back out here. And so they pack up their tent, they pack up all their supplies, and they put everything back in their boat. They get out onto Flat River, and at some point very early on in their journey back, the boat capsizes, and the boat actually breaks apart from the strength of the rapids of Flat River. And so the boat actually just sinks, and much of their supplies sink, including all of their gold. But the three brothers are able to grab some of their supplies, like their rifle and some lumber and some of their mining supplies, and they swim it all to shore. They catch their breath. They're totally devastated at the loss of the gold, but they're alive. They have enough supplies to survive. And so they figure all they can do is maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold because they did still have a sluice, and then try to get out of there and then, regroup and come back another time. And so using some of the lumber they recovered from their broken boat, and then also by cutting down some trees, they literally fashioned another boat and then hopped back on the Flat River, and they went back up to that site where they had found gold earlier. They set up their sluice, they set up their camp again, and this time they didn't find any gold. So all day, this very disappointing day that they've already lost all their gold, now they're not finding any more gold. And so that night when they went to bed, they decided that the next day they were just going to leave. And so the next day they get up, they pack up, they hop back on the Flat River on this new boat they built, and they're able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they get back home, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, start talking about how they want to go back into Nahanni Valley and go get more gold, because now they know there's gold out there. It's not a question, yeah, we didn't find it that second time, but we know it's out there.
Charlie, the older brother, he wanted to get the gold, but he felt like, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I don't know if it's a good idea, so I'm actually not going to go. You guys can go, I'm going to stay. And so several months goes by, and Frank and Willie have been doing all this preparation for this additional trip into the valley. And finally, in 1905, they're ready. And so Willie, Frank, and a third man called Robert Weir, who was a friend of theirs, he was going to replace Charlie. The three of them, they make their way up into the valley. Now, they didn't tell anyone how long they were going to be gone for, and so when they didn't send any word and no one had heard from them in weeks, Charlie was actually not that concerned because he knew there was lots of gold to be had out in the Nahanni Valley, and so he figured they must have struck it rich, and now they've decided to live out there long term, or at least maybe through the summer, or maybe the next year, and so he wasn't concerned, and because he wasn't concerned, nobody else was concerned about these three men. And so weeks turned into months, turned into a year, and still no one's heard from these three men. No one's heard from Willie, Frank, or from Robert, but still Charlie maintains that nothing can be wrong because there's three of them out there. They're incredibly experienced. There is a ton of gold out there. I'm sure they're just killing it and they're just acquiring all this gold, and we're going to see them in the next couple of months maybe, and everything's going to be just fine. But a whole other year would go by. So they've been out there for 2 years and no one has heard from them. And at this point, Charlie thinks to himself, okay, I have to go out and see if they're okay. And so he rounds up 4 other people from his town and he mounts an expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to go find his 2 brothers and find Robert Weir. Charlie and his search party eventually, after yet another long and arduous journey, they get into Nahanni Valley and they get onto the Flat River. And so they start making their way upstream along Flat River. So it must have been a very treacherous journey getting through the rapids of this river. And the whole time they're scanning the left and the right side, hoping to see some sign of life. They're looking for any indication that these 3 men are out here and just fine, but they didn't see any sign of them. And so they finally made their way all the way up to the very end of Flat River, or I should say the very beginning of Flat River, where it breaks off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. And once they turned onto the South Nahanni River, they began going downstream. And again, they're looking on either side for any sign of these 3 men. There's no sign of them. And then the river they're on takes a very sharp turn. It's actually called the Big Bend, and it's about a 45-degree turn. And as soon as you make that turn, it dumps you into this 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, along South Nahanni River, which is about 350 miles long, there are these 4 canyons that the water passes through. And they're labeled 4th Canyon, 3rd Canyon, 2nd Canyon, and 1st Canyon. And these canyons are massive. These sheer cliffs on either side of the river shoot up to 3,000 feet above the water, and in some parts the water is actually just as deep, thousands of feet deep. And Second Canyon is unique because the cliff faces are as sheer as you're going to get, and the cliff faces almost butt up exactly up against the water. So there's really very little shoreline on either side. So once you're in this 10-mile stretch, you're basically boxed in. You have thousands of feet of water below you. You have these massive cliffs on either side, and there's really nowhere to go. You need to get through this section of the river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline and take a break from being in your boat. And along these cliffs are these openings you see high up all over the cliffs on both sides that are openings to these massive cave systems inside of these thousands of feet tall cliffs. And because of how difficult it is to not only get to Nahanni Valley, but also to get up to these different cave openings, nobody's gone inside of them. We don't know what's inside of these caves, save for the few that are down low enough that people can explore. So as you're passing through Second Canyon, it's almost like you're being watched because there's all of these openings, but you can't see into them, and you're just forced to go down this 10-mile stretch, and you can't really go anywhere, and whatever's watching you, it's watching you. As soon as Charlie and his search party entered into Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker, because that's another part of being in Second Canyon. These huge cliff walls of this canyon obscure the sunlight, and so they would have entered into this canyon, it would have gotten darker, and it's very windy inside of Second Canyon. So the winds would have picked up, so it's dark, very very strange setting for them to be in, and they would have been looking on either side at these little strips of shoreline on either side, barely big enough for a boat to be. They would have been looking for any sign of life, but they didn't see anything. As they're making their way down this 10-mile stretch, as they're getting closer and closer to actually entering into First Canyon, which is the next canyon you would enter into, the sides of the river start to get slightly larger, where you could actually beach a boat. There's some trees, and on the left-hand side, right before exiting Second Canyon, they notice there is actually a tent perched within some trees. And so the search party naturally goes right over to the shoreline. They hop out, but as soon as they step foot on land and they have a clearer view of this tent and what's outside of it, they notice there is a body clearly lying on the ground outside of the tent. And so Charlie and the search party, they run over, and as soon as they're up close, they can tell this body is missing its head. And they see the clothes on this body are totally charred and burned, and whoever this was, they were reaching with their right arm when they died. And right outside of the reach of their right arm was a rifle that was propped up against a tree. And so they walk around this one body, and they go around towards the backside of the tent where the opening to this tent is, and they find another body, another very badly decomposed body, and it's positioned kind of halfway in the tent and halfway out of the tent. And there's a blanket kind of partially obscuring this person's body, and when they move the blanket, they see this body too is missing its head. So Charlie and the search party, they continue to search around the camp in hopes of finding the heads of these two people to try to figure out who they are, but they never find the heads. However, they do find some personal effects both in the pockets of these two bodies and then also inside the tent that would confirm these are Charlie's brothers. As for the third man that had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite, and in fact he would never actually be found officially. However, a little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be found several months later that was attributed to Robert. However, that was not 100% confirmed to be Robert. The only other interesting thing that was found at this campsite was a carving in a nearby tree, and it just said, "We have found a fine prospect," indicating that Charlie's brothers had found gold. But there was no gold either on them or in their camp or in the river nearby. Nothing. There was no gold. Charlie and his search party would leave the valley and get in touch with the mounted police, who would come out to the site where the brothers had been found. They would launch an investigation, and ultimately they would come to the conclusion that all three of these men, the two brothers and Robert, had starved to death, and then after they had perished, animals had taken them off, which is why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie did not believe that. He believed they had been attacked by native tribes in the area, but the police were not buying that. They said this was a natural thing, this was an accident, and so that's that. When the story of these two decapitated men made the news, people went crazy about this. People were very divided about what they thought really happened. There was a percentage of people that believed that partial skeleton that was found, that was not Robert Weir. He had not died. He had murdered the two brothers, decapitated them, and then made off with their gold. The other percentage of people believed that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had been attacked by a person, a group of people, an animal, a creature, something. There was some sort of attack. And that's why the two brothers were in those positions that indicated they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother reaching for the gun and the other appearing to have leapt from his bed before he ultimately died. But regardless of which side you fell on, pretty much everybody at the time who heard about the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. Specifically, they became terrified of that stretch in Second Canyon where the two brothers had been found. And so actually that stretch got renamed the Headless Valley, and from that point forward, that's all it was known as. And so even though there were obvious gold prospects in the Headless Valley and all along the South Nahanni River and the Flat River, people, after this story broke, were just not prepared to risk going in there and potentially becoming another victim. And so people kind of stayed away from Nahanni Valley. 8 years later, though, in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided, you know what, I'm not going to let some scary stories about some headless men and, ghosts and killers on the loose, I'm not going to let any of that get in the way of me taking gold out of Nahanni Valley. So all on his own, Martin makes the arduous trek inside of Nahanni Valley. He makes his way up Flat River, and he finally finds a spot about 70 miles upstream of where Headless Valley was, and he actually built a one-room cabin because he was going to stay there through the winter there. And then the plan was he would meet up with his partners the following summer. And so right after he got there, he set up his sluices and he started mining for gold. And apparently he found a lot of it because he sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had made it rich. And so his partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he got because they planned on going back into the valley with him that summer. So that summer rolls around, his partners go to the meeting spot right outside the valley, but Martin doesn't show up. And so his partners, they stay outside at this meeting space for several days until finally, when he doesn't show up, they decide, we have to go in there and see if he is okay, because at this point he should have been here. There's no excuse. And so they end up going into the Nahanni Valley. They make their way up Flat River and they go roughly to the area where they knew he was staying based on the message he had sent earlier. He had described where he was staying and they actually found his cabin. Or I should say they found what was left of his cabin. His cabin had been completely torched, burned to the ground, and laying on the ground next to the burned out cabin was the burned out remains of another headless corpse. And this corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police did a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the two McLeod brothers' deaths, even though they were all decapitated. They were in roughly the same area, and it happened within a few years of each other, and they looked very, very similar, even though that all was true. The police said, nope, these are totally separate. Martin died for some reason, and then animals took parts of him away, and that's why his skull is missing. Martin's skull was never located, and the gold that Martin claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin, not on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. When Martin's death made the news, people went crazy, and despite the police assuring everyone that his death was not connected to the McLeod brothers' deaths, even though the police were saying that, the public didn't see it that way. It was just too easy to connect one decapitation with two other decapitations that have happened close together in a relatively short time frame, and so a lot of people assumed there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, the rumors of a killer on the loose were still alive and well when gold prospector John O'Brien and his partner decided, you know what, despite the rumors of this so-called killer or whatever's going on in the Nahanni Valley, let's go into the Nahanni Valley and try our hand. Let's try to get some gold. And so the two of them made their way into the valley and they set up camp in Headless Valley, not far from where the McLeod brothers had been found decapitated. So they set up their camp and they're there for a couple of days. They're doing well. They're finding gold. And then at some point, John tells his partner that he's going to go out and check all of their traps along the river. And he'll be back in about 8 or 9 days. And so his partner waits 8 or 9 days and John doesn't come back. And a couple of days after that goes by and now John's past due. And so the partner decides he has to go out looking for him. And so there was another gold prospector in the area. And so this partner contacted him and the two of them went to the river and began walking upstream until they found John. And he had frozen to death, but it was very interesting the way he was positioned. He was sitting in front of this obviously previously lit campfire. He wasn't hunched over. He didn't look like he was in pain. He looked like he was just enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort or pain or fear. He was even holding the matchbook in his hand. It was like he was just sitting there enjoying the fire when something caused him to suddenly freeze. In fact, witnesses would say John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to freezing to death. And the police, when they came out, they would say, this is odd. This is odd the way he's positioned. But ultimately, he died because he froze to death. And so there's no foul play here. And so no further investigation is needed. 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the Flat River inside of Headless Valley. And so that night, they're all kind of joking around the fire. And then at some point, they decide to all go to sleep. And then the next day, when everybody gets up, Annie is no longer in camp and there's no sign of where she went. And so they begin by yelling out and walking around the immediate vicinity to see maybe if she stepped away for a minute, but Annie's just gone and no one knows where she went. And so the hunting party spends the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there's no sign of her. They ultimately leave the valley. They tell police come out. There's this huge search, but Annie's never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River, near this hunting party when they were out there, but Charlie himself was not in the hunting party. He didn't know Annie. He was just in the vicinity. He overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. And when he heard that, he knew he had to tell police what he had seen that night out near Flat River. So he goes to police and he explains that that night, when he knew there was this hunting party over there, he could hear them, he knew they were over there, he said at some point he went to bed and then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge. So he sits up and he looks out across the river. It's totally dark, but there's some moonlight, and he's kind of looking around wondering what's causing the sound, but he can't see it, and then he hears it again, and he can tell it's off to his left. And these are not huge rocks. These are like medium to small size rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. And so he's looking, and all of a sudden he sees, maybe a couple hundred yards away through some sparse trees, he sees a naked woman, a white naked woman, running on all fours up this mountainside. And as she's running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands are knocking little rocks into the river down below. She's right on the edge of this cliff. And as she's running up this hill, she stops and she turns, and he gets a good look at her face. And Charlie would say he was so taken aback by her face. It looked like she was possessed. There was something wrong with her face. And so Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her, even though he knew anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds is doomed. But he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something wrong with this woman. And so the police, they take this story down and they say, hey, this is what Annie looked like. And Charlie would say, I think that's her. I think that matches her description. And so universally, it's believed this woman galloping up this hillside in the middle of the night naked was Annie. The police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further because at the time Charlie was telling them this piece of information, she'd already been gone for months, and the assumption was she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decides to try their luck in Headless Valley. A man named Phil Powers. He makes his way into the valley. He finds a spot off of Flat River. He builds a cabin, and then shortly thereafter, his cabin burns to the ground with him inside of it. Now, his skeleton was intact, but the strange thing about his death is based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof. He should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin before it burned down, giving rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire started. However, the police said this was an accident caused by Phil doing something with the stovepipe that led to it catching on fire, and this was just all one big accident. But the vast majority of people that have followed along to this point with all of these strange deaths, they were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, two more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, they entered the Headless Valley to try their luck, and shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin, and just like Phil Powers, it had burned to the ground, but William and Joseph were not in the ashes. They were not anywhere nearby. In fact, they were never found. No one has any idea what happened to them, and no one knows what caused the fire. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector named Ernest Sabbard entered the Headless Valley to go looking for gold, and then when he did not leave the valley for an intended rendezvous with some of his partners went looking for him, and they would find him inside of his sleeping bag, laying down, decapitated right along the Flat River inside of the Headless Valley. And so the police would come out, they would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident where, he starved to death or he died of hypothermia, and then after he was dead, animals must have come in and removed his skull, and that's why we can't find it. And so the police did not, at least not publicly, connect his death to all of the other decapitations in that small area. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley, and he went missing. And so a search party went in looking for him, and John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near Flat River, some native tribes people came into their camp, and they warned them about some white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They're down near the river, they're out in the forest, they're kind of all around here, and so you really need to be careful. You don't want them to see you. And then these tribes people just left. And so the search party is absolutely horrified. They know about the rumors of this place. They're out here looking for someone that's gone missing in this place. And all night, all they hear are distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard in the previous nights. They're hearing these wailing sounds coming from all around them, like these things that are out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing when they got up and they left, the leader of that search party would say he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister, and that constant wailing they heard the night before, he said he will never forget. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far less strange incidents reported inside of Nahanni Valley, but one could attribute that to the fact that far less people have been going into Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s. And in recent times, huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment of the park, but other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley. And the truth is, nobody knows why.